broadcast tonight, the two Koreas exchange fire across the western maritime border after Pyongyang shells from a military drill fall in waters south of the disputed sea boundary. North Korea warns it could carry out a new form of nuclear tests after the UN Security Council condemned its latest ballistic missile launch. Plus, a group of South Korean researchers develops a patch that could diagnose health problems automatically and help patients receive medication at the very moment they need it. These stories and more next on ARIRANG News at 8.
우리 지역에서 정상적인 타격을 벌여나가고 있다.
Good evening to our viewers in Korea and hello to those of you who are watching from around the world. It's Monday, March 31st here in Seoul. I am Junichi Ihara. We begin this evening with the latest skirmish between the two Koreas. Seoul and Pyongyang exchanged fire across the western maritime border Monday after the North's artillery shells fell into waters in the south. But for more on the renewed tensions on the Korean peninsula, we go live to our correspondent Hwang Sung-hee at the ARIRANG News Center. Ms. Sung-hee, what can you tell us?
Ji-hye, the exchange of fire between the two Koreas came to an end at about 3:30 p.m. Korea time, although there is a possibility of more shellings later tonight. It all began a little past noon on this Monday after North Korea began live fire drills in 7 West Sea border regions north of the northern limit line. South Korea's defense ministry said North Korea fired around 500 artillery shells in waters north of the northern limit line, and that some 100 of those shells fell south of the NLL in South Korean waters near Baekneung-do Island. In response, the South Korean military shot around 300 artillery shells back across the NLL using K-9 self-propelled howitzers. Thousands of residents on South Korea's border islands were sent into shelters for cover. Pyongyang says Monday's drills were part of its regular military exercises. Now, North Korea had notified South Korea of its plans to conduct live fire drills this morning, not giving a specific time for the planned exercise, but demanding that Seoul keep its vessels out of the training zone.
And Sung-hee, we hear that the South Korean military is still on high alert in case of a follow-up provocations from the north.
That's right. South Korea's defense ministry said it sees North Korea's live fire drill as a pre-planned provocation. This is the first time in recent history that the North has conducted a live fire drill in all 7 West Sea border regions. And it's also the first time that the North has informed the South of the exercise ahead of the time. The ministry said the South Korean military will work closely with the United States and keep close watch for possible clashes. The South Korean military has activated crisis management operations and has deployed naval convoys near the NLL to cope with any contingencies. The Standing Committee of South Korea's National Security Council convened an emergency meeting Monday evening to discuss the North's motives behind its latest provocations. The committee, which is headed by the top presidential security advisor Kim Jang-soo, talked about the possibility of Pyongyang's further provocations and Seoul's plans for a strong and firm response when needed. The South Korean government will take measures to protect the safety of South Koreans, not only near the western maritime border, but also near the demilitarized zone. Also, at around 3 p.m., the UN Command's Military Armistice Command proposed to hold a general-level meeting with the North by 5 this evening. However, that deadline came and went without any response from the North. Now, it's worth mentioning that this is not the first time the North has fired artillery shells in this direction. In 2010, North Korea launched artillery strikes on a South Korean border island, killing 4 people. Ji-hye?
All right, thank you very much for that report, Sung-hee. That was ARIRANG News' Hwang Sung-hee with the latest on the skirmish between the two Koreas. Now, meanwhile, North Korea's live fire drills came in the midst of the largest amphibious landing drill on the Korean peninsula in 2 decades. Our Kim Hyun-bin reports from Pohang.
U.S. and South Korean Marines blaze across the water to secure the shoreline and their positions on Korea's southeastern coast. The Marines are here for the joint South Korea-U.S. amphibious landing exercise, dubbed Double Dragon, which started on March 27th and runs through April 7th. As part of the annual Fall Eagle drills between the two allies.
Through this joint exercise, Korea and U.S. forces are working as one to suppress war with our might while enhancing our interoperability.
This is the largest amphibious landing drill in South Korea in 2 decades, with over 12,500 U.S. and South Korean forces taking part. The 3rd Marines Expeditionary Brigade from Okinawa is here, along with 22 Osprey multi-mission aircraft, 13 naval vessels, and others. The Expeditionary Brigade played an active role in the Iraq War, and if a conflict were to break out on the peninsula, they'll be among the first to arrive.
Both the people of South Korea and the citizens of the United States ought to rest assured that their military is taking their missions very serious, that we're training as hard as we can. We're trying to do this in the most economical fashion that we can.
The Double Dragon drill seeks to enhance interoperability and working relationships between the 2 militaries across a range of operations, from disaster relief to complex expeditionary operations.
North Korea has condemned the drills, calling them a rehearsal for an invasion. Some experts said given the level of anger, it is highly likely that Pyongyang will conduct a ballistic missile launch or a 4th nuclear test before the drill is over on April 7th. Kim Hyun-bin, ARIRANG News, Pohang.
And speaking of growing threats out of North Korea, the regime warned on Sunday that it could carry out a new form of nuclear test after the UN Security Council condemned its latest ballistic missile launch. Our Shin Se-min reports.
Despite Pyongyang's threat to carry out a 4th nuclear test, the South Korean government says there are no signs to indicate that one is in the works.
North Korea is capable of conducting nuclear or long-range missile tests at any time, but for now, there are no imminent signs of nuclear tests or missile launches.
Protesting a UN condemnation of its medium-range Nodong ballistic missile launches last week, North Korea raised tensions Sunday by threatening to conduct a new type of nuclear test. It was the regime's first mid-range missile launch in 4 years and followed a series of short-range rocket firings over the past 2 months.
We would not rule out a new form of nuclear test for bolstering our nuclear deterrence.
In response, Seoul's foreign ministry warned North Korea to keep in mind that it will pay the price if it neglects the grave demands from its neighbors and the international community and pushes ahead with another nuclear test. The United States also urged North Korea to refrain from disturbing regional peace and security, saying any nuclear test or ballistic missile launch are a grave violation of UN Security Council resolutions and that it will only further isolating Pyongyang. According to 38 North, a website run by the U.S.-Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins University, recent satellite imagery shows mountains north and south of North Korea's Punggye-ri test site have been excavated to complexes that could allow for multiple tests. Joel Witt, a former State Department official and editor of the 38 North website, said North Korea is capable of carrying out a test within 4 to 6 weeks once it decides to do so. Shin Se-min, ARIRANG News.
In a mixed signal, North Korea is reportedly open to discussing its abduction of Japanese nationals over 3 decades ago. That's according to Japan's Kyodo News, quoting Junichi Ihara, the head of the Japanese delegation that met with North Korean officials in high-level talks over the past 2 days. Ihara said North Korea didn't reject Tokyo's demand for an investigation into the whereabouts of hundreds of Japanese nationals allegedly abducted by Pyongyang in the 70s and 80s. He also said he protested Pyongyang's recent provocations, including its threat to carry out a new form of nuclear test and its launch of medium-range ballistic missiles last week. The government-level talks between the 2 nations were the first in more than a year. Now, there is a bumpy road ahead for the upcoming Korea-Japan ministerial meeting in April. There are even talks of the dialogue not taking place at all, as the 2 sides are struggling to work out an agenda over historical issues. Connie Kim has more.
Korea and Japan aren't seeing eye to eye on the agenda for ministerial-level talks scheduled for April, and new reports suggest they may not meet at all. A foreign ministry official from Seoul reaffirmed on Sunday that the discussions would focus solely on the women who were forced by the Japanese military to work as sex slaves during the Second World War. That runs counter to what a Japanese foreign ministry official told the press Friday. The official said the talks should not only center on the comfort woman issue, but also on other points of contention between the two countries. Chief Secretary Yoshihide Suga said Thursday that discussions should also include his government's claims over Korea-controlled Dokdo Island. If the two countries fail to sit down at the negotiating table in April, it's expected to have a further effect on bilateral relations. Tokyo proposed a ministerial-level talks to Seoul as a concession ahead of its trilateral summit with Korea and the United States last week. Korea's efforts to raise awareness of the comfort woman issue continues on an unofficial level. The House of Sharing, a shelter for former sex slaves, said it has invited Japan's First Lady Akie Abe for a visit. The proposal was made in mid-March during a meeting with Japanese diplomats. Connie Kim, ARIRANG News.
For the latest news that impacts Korea and the world, join Yuji He for a lively half hour that covers politics, business, international news, and much more. Live at 8 every weeknight on ARIRANG TV.
Move aimed at fostering startups is part of the government's 3-year economic innovation. Some welcome news on the trade front. Korea posted a current account surplus for the 24th straight month in February as imports declined and the services account the deficit narrowed. Hwang Ji-hye has the details.
Korea's central bank said Monday that the nation posted a current account surplus of over $4.5 billion last month. That's up over $1 billion from January and more than double from February of last year. Exports of goods rose over 7% from the previous year to $48 billion, while imports edged up slightly more than 1% to $42.6 billion. When asked if the surplus was coming from the nation's sluggish domestic demand, officials at the central bank said no, that the subdued import numbers were due to stable global commodities prices. The deficit in the service account, which includes tourism and shipping, also fell, helping the nation log a current account surplus for the 24th straight month. It posted a shortfall of around $1.5 billion last month, compared with a deficit of nearly $2 billion in January. The current account data was released based on a new international standard under which last year's current account surplus widened to $79.8 billion, up around $9 billion from the previous data. The central bank said last year's surplus accounted for 6% of the nation's gross domestic product. The nation's current account surplus has been acting as a buffer for Korea since the U.S. Federal Reserve began scaling back its massive bond-buying stimulus program. Hwang Ji-hye, ARIRANG News.
The Korea Central Bank says it's keeping close watch of low inflation trends and will respond accordingly if necessary. In its monetary policy report Monday, the Bank of Korea said it would manage its monetary policy to work toward bringing consumer prices back into its inflation target band of 2.5% to 3.5%. This as low oil and farm prices and free childcare programs fade out. The BOK forecasts that a growth of consumer prices will pick up to 2.3% in 2014 from 1.3% gain in 2013. Consumer prices fell below the central bank's inflation target band for the 21st straight month in February. The government is working tirelessly to put President Park Geun-hye's deregulation plans in motion. The Finance Ministry is fast-tracking the procedure for getting a revised bill into the hands of lawmakers. Our Kwon So-ah has the details.
The government wants a quicker and more direct route towards deregulation, and they're doing all they can to make it happen. A high-level official at the Ministry of Strategy and Finance said Monday that the timing and speed at which deregulation takes place is important, and for that reason the ministry is working with the Ministry of Justice and other related offices to speed up the process. Ministries are typically required 40 days prior notice that they will be proposing a revised bill, with another 20 days tacked on for screening by legislative bodies and the Regulatory Reform Committee. But the Finance Ministry is working to cut that 60-day time frame in half to 30. Similar deregulation plans were also been mentioned by the Transport Ministry last week when it announced that individuals and businesses will be allowed to transition commercial trucks into food trucks. This came less than a week after President Park pledged to reduce the volume of regulations by 20% of the current level by 2016. It's a plan of a 3-year economic innovation plan which intends to revitalize investment and ultimately create more jobs. Kwon So-ah, ARIRANG News.
Two Samsung Group companies are merging. The deal announced Monday has Samsung SDI, the group's unit in charge of developing battery technologies, acquiring the group's textile firm, Seoul Industries. The merger will be finalized in July, and when that's done, Samsung SDI will be one of the conglomerate's biggest business units with market capitalization of 10 trillion won, or roughly $9.3 billion, and assets worth $14 billion. Samsung SDI has been developing display and parts technologies with a new emphasis on batteries since the year 2002. Seoul Industries has been involved in the fashion, chemical, and electronic material industries since being founded in 1954. The cities of Seoul and Beijing will sign an agreement this week to jointly tackle air pollution in Northeast Asia. The Seoul city government said Monday that Mayor Park Won-soon will head to China to ink the deal with Winning Mid's Beijing Mayor Wang An-shun on Thursday. The agreement states that air pollution, including ultrafine dust, should be resolved regionally and that both cities cooperate closely on the issue. During his trip, Park will also visit China's first observatory that measures pollutants. Smog from China is regarded as a major source of air pollution on the Korean peninsula. Over now to a groundbreaking research by a group of Korean scientists. They have developed a wearable patch that uses the latest nanotechnology to monitor, store data, and deliver drugs to patients. Our Park Ji-won tells us how it works.
It looks like a simple Band-Aid that can be easily adapted to a patient's skin, but it is much more complex than that. Thanks to nanotechnology, this flexible plaster can monitor patients' muscle activity and store information on their movements. After analyzing the data, it finally delivers the drugs via the skin.
This technology is important as it has established a systematic connection from monitoring and storing medical information like a patient's movements to delivering drugs after analyzing the data.
As this thin adhesive plaster can be stretched to allow for patients' movements, the patch could be a significant breakthrough in the treatment of movement disorder diseases like Parkinson's.
Temperature sensors or other biosensors can easily be added onto this on-the-skin device. It can also be used for multifunctional purposes in the prevention and treatment of diseases by effectively monitoring patients' conditions and delivering drugs in response to the data.
The team also say the patch could be very useful for telemedicine if attached with wireless communication technology. The study was published in the most recent edition of the scientific journal Nature Nanotechnology. Park Ji-won, ARIRANG News.
Let's check on some of the stories making headlines on the global front, from the U.S.-Russia talks on Ukraine to a new travel alert in Southeast Asia. We go live to our Paulie at the News Center. Paul, let's start with Washington-Moscow dialogue that took place in Paris. Did the two sides manage to hammer out a deal to reduce tensions over Russia's annexation?
No deal. After 4 hours of talks, the top American and Russian diplomats agreed on one thing, that the crisis in Ukraine requires a diplomatic solution. But they agreed on little else. Our Ji Myung-gil has more.
U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov discussed ways to resolve the Ukraine crisis during talks in Paris on Sunday. But the two men parted ways without any agreement in place.
In a frank conversation this evening with Foreign Minister Lavrov, I made clear that the United States still considers the Russian actions to be illegal and illegitimate, and Russia's actions over the past several weeks have placed it at odds, obviously, with the rule of law and the international community.
After 4 hours of talks, both sides recognized the importance of finding a diplomatic solution that meets the needs of the Ukrainian people. But they agreed on little else. Lavrov repeated that Russia has no plans to invade Ukraine and said he and Kerry had discussed setting up a neutral federal government in Ukraine.
All political forces in Ukraine will have an equal voice and can agree on which kind of concrete political, economic, financial, social, religious traditions will be respected in different parts of the country so that it becomes united and represents all the values of the Ukrainian people.
Ukrainian officials are hesitant to decentralize power. They fear that doing so would give more power to pro-Russia regions, something that could harm its aspirations to be a greater part of Europe and potentially tear the country apart. The Kerry-Lavrov meeting in Paris came days before NATO foreign ministers meet in Brussels on Tuesday and Wednesday, where talks are likely to center on Russia and its actions in Crimea and Ukraine. Kim Young-gil, ARIRANG News.
And Paul, it's been nearly 4 weeks since the Malaysian airliner vanished en route to Beijing. Any progress in the new search?
An international team of 10 aircraft and up to 10 ships entered the search zone Monday. However, nothing of significance has been found. Authorities shifted operations northeast in the Indian Ocean based on new satellite images last week showing possible debris, but several floating objects found in recent days are not believed to be part of the missing plane. Despite the lack of progress, Australia's Prime Minister said Monday there will be no time limit placed on the search.
We owe it to everyone to do whatever we reasonably can, and we can keep searching for quite some time to come, and we will keep searching for quite some time to come.
Officials say they still believe the Boeing 777 was deliberately diverted when it vanished on March 8th. By whom and why remains a mystery.
And heading over to Egypt, we hear the election dates are out. When will the people start heading to the polls?
The main election commission says the first round of voting will be held on May 26th and 27th. They added if the first place candidate does not achieve a wide enough margin, voters will need to cast a second ballot in June. However, they did not clarify how wide of a margin that would be. The head of the main organizing committee, Judge Anwar al-Assi, announced the details Sunday in a televised press conference.
The first round of voting for the president commences during the days of Monday and Tuesday, the 26th and 27th of May, starting at 8 a.m. and ending on 8 p.m. for both days. Voting is held in the polling stations decided upon by the High Electoral Committee as per the number of registered voters.
Former General Abdel al-Fattah al-Sisi, who ousted Egypt's first freely elected leader Mohamed Morsi, is widely expected to win the election on the back of strong majority support. Al-Sisi stepped down as defense minister and head of the country's armed forces last week in order to announce his candidacy.
And Paul, lastly, a recent health alert for those planning on traveling to Southeast Asia. What seems to be the matter?
Well, the Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention issued a health advisory on Monday over the growing number of cases of measles in Southeast Asia. The largest outbreaks of the disease have been reported in the city of Manila and other areas in the Philippines. According to the KCDC, of the nearly 15,000 suspected cases of the disease reported this year, around 3,400 were confirmed to be infected. That surpassed all cases reported in 2013. Korean health authorities are recommending that all travelers to the region should make sure they've received their two-stage measles vaccination before going abroad. Jie?
All right, Paul, thank you very much for that update. We'll see you back in just about 2 hours. Let's get a check on the weather conditions with our Kim Bo-kyung at the Weather Center. The Pyongyang cherry blossom festivals have moved up due to the warm weather.
That's right, Chi-hye. As a result of the unseasonably high temperatures we enjoyed last week, flowers have begun to bloom about 2 weeks earlier than usual. Taking a look at the current conditions, the nation is under the influence of a high pressure system from the West Sea, which is why we're seeing light clouds across the map. The last time cherry blossoms or flowers bloomed in March was back in 1922. And for those of you who didn't know, the 2014 Yeouido Cherry Blossom Festival will be held from April 3rd through the 13th. So if you're headed to check out the flowers or for a late night trip, make sure to grab a cardigan as it may feel chillier in the evening. Other than that, daytime highs will continue to remain in the low to mid 20s through Wednesday. Taking a look at tomorrow's readings, Seoul, Daegu, and Gwangju make it to 23 degrees while Busan hits 19. Moving on to other regions, Jeju tops out at 19 degrees, Dokdo and Mount Kumgang peak in the mid-teens. Back to you, Ji-hye.
And that brings us to the end of our newscast. I'm Yoo Ji-hye in Seoul. I'll be back with more news updates on our primetime news at 10 p.m. Korea time. See you then.